This is the Asia Trade. I'm Shery in Tokyo.
I'm Avril in Singapore. The top stories this hour. Asia to catch a tailwind from the latest blockbuster AI chips deal, with AMD soaring as it signs up to build infrastructure for OpenAI. Wall Street now on its longest winning streak since May. We hear from executives of both companies, with AMD taking a high-stakes chance to challenge NVIDIA's lead in the AI computing industry. Plus, Japanese stock futures pointing to further gains as a senior advisor to incoming Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi tells Bloomberg the BOJ should not hike rates this month. We've just seen the Senate vote to end the government shutdown in the U.S. failing yet again. We've heard comments from the U.S. president on Truth Social blaming the Democrats pretty much. But you look at the way that U.S. stocks have performed, not only is the S&P 500 on its longest winning streak since May, all-time highs, that AMD-OpenAI deal really unlocking the value potentially for AMD. And we're seeing how all-time highs, or rather AMD stock surge about 38% overnight. That is actually helping the other semiconductor-related stocks as well. So we saw the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index climbing and helping to close the gap with the Mag 7s. Now, aside from that, of course, we also saw Brockman and NVIDIA stocks sliding. So that's something that we're going to watch potentially in the session today, Shery.
Yeah, especially here in Japan, because you have highly exposed companies like Ibiden with revenue coming from AMD. So we'll be watching that open, as Nikkei futures are now not doing much after surging to record highs. Of course, we have the victory of Sanae Takaichi, pro-stimulus. She's expected to become the next prime minister of Japan. And you saw the Japanese yen weaken past that 150 level against the US dollar. We're watching very closely what was happening with JGBs as well, especially with the long end underperforming and yield spiking, of course, on fiscal concerns. We are expecting more spending here. The Aussie dollar, in fact, jumping to the highest level in 10 months against the Japanese yen. You do have the staggered open in Australia with daylight savings this week getting started. You can see they are down 0.2% early at the open. You have offshore yuan at 714 level. Of course, we do have China, Hong Kong, and South Korea still away on holidays.
Shery, it's really about that tech deal, AMD landing this blockbuster chip deal with OpenAI to build AI infrastructure, sending the stock surging as it mounts a challenge to NVIDIA. CEO Lisa Su told us is the largest deployment the company has ever announced.
I have full confidence in, OpenAI, Sam, Greg, Sarah. I mean, this is a massive opportunity for us. Right now, right here, it's about who has the most compute and how fast can we get it online. And we're committing to doing this together.
Let's get more with Bloomberg Intelligence Global Head of Technology Research, Mandeep Singh. So, Mandeep, OpenAI is really showing its golden touch here. Talk to us about how much revenue this potentially unlocks for AMD.
Yeah, look, I mean, the AI data center market right now is close to $250 billion market. Everyone is expecting that market to quadruple to $1 trillion by the end of the decade. And, this deal gives OpenAI some equity in AMD stock if it hits a certain level. At the same time, I mean, AMD could easily become a 15 to 20% market share sort of player if this were to pan out and AMD is able to ramp up the capacity, because it's going to go by gigawatts. And this deal is about adding up to 6 gigawatts, which could take AMD to that 15 to 20% market share over time. But clearly, this is a big deal given AMD's market position right now is almost, low single-digit share in that AI data center market.
6 gigawatts, which is just over half the size of an agreement reached with NVIDIA earlier by OpenAI as well. How important are these two companies in the broader tech sphere right now?
I mean, look, right now, NVIDIA almost had a monopoly in that $250 billion market that I referenced, and Broadcom is a distant second player. What happened with AMD was at the risk of getting left behind. So if NVIDIA is investing in OpenAI to add up to 10 gigawatts and AMD can add up to 6 gigawatts, that's pretty substantial in the context of new capacity getting added. And all the hyperscalers are adding their own capacity as well. So we are talking about a big infrastructure build out, but AMD will be a player. And I think that's quite significant for the company, given its market positioning as of today.
BI's Global Head of Technology Research, Mandeep Singh, there with the latest on those deals in the tech sector that, of course, are fueling that AI frenzy. And not surprising, given this idiosyncratic news in tech and the idiosyncratic rallies that we're seeing in a very small sector of the market. You can see this chart on the Bloomberg, how the correlation in the S&P 500 is collapsing. We're talking about the correlation between members of the constituents here in the S&P 500 and the broader benchmark being very low, and it's really a dramatic chart. But let's bring in our senior editor for markets and Bloomberg opinion columnist, John Authors. John, given how a small part of the market is continuing to rally, what are you seeing in terms of market health?
Well, I've been proved wrong a number of times, but as all-time highs go for the stock market, this is one of the less convincing ones. As you point out, it's very narrow. Also, it's very unusual to see an all-time high coupled with quite such a big all-time high also for gold. Since Donald Trump was elected in November last year, the S&P 500 has underperformed gold by 20%. In other words, if it was denominated in gold rather than dollars, it would be in a bear market now for the second Trump era. And I think that's quite important. Yes, there are exciting things happening, but note, again, with the AMD deal, in many ways, this is about one company beating another. It's not about any particularly great new creation of value. And if you look at what's happening to the gold price, if you're looking at the way people are retreating from bonds, given the political crisis in France, the shock from Japan, this is a somewhat unconvincing stock market rally.
John, to your point about what's going on in France and Japan, we are waiting to see what exactly Takaichi's policies will look like. There's been a lot of harkening back to Abenomics.
Yes.
What do you think, out of those three arrows that we've been looking at, how much filling in of the blanks are you expecting?
I think, it's obviously the case that she was very much of a loyal acolyte of Abe, and that we will see some significant continuation of the philosophy of Abenomics under Takaichi. But I think the market might be getting wrong exactly how she intends to do that. The first phase of Abenomics involved, massive run on the yen and, dramatically dovish monetary policy. That isn't an option to anything like the same extent now that Japan actually has inflation. She's made it obvious, and any competent politician should grasp this, that inflation is now a serious political problem in Japan, and it has to be dealt with. That is going to put a limit on exactly how dovish the BOJ can be under a Takaichi administration, and it probably puts a limit on the fiscal wherewithal that they're going to bring to bear. I think this is going to be much more about getting the third arrow to actually hit. The third arrow is improving corporate governance, getting, in China they call this anti-involution, but it seems to be quite similar in Japan. There are a large number of sectors which are very over-competitive, and although philosophically there's a huge difference between Sanai Takaichi, who likes Hayek, and Xi Jinping, who still says that he likes Marx and Mao, they're both actually trying to do something quite similar, which is eliminate overcapacity and overcompetition.
John, great to get your insights. Thanks so much. Senior Editor for Markets and Bloomberg Opinion columnist John Authors.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll discuss market strategy in Japan and beyond following Sanae Takaichi's surprise victory in the ruling party leadership race. LDP lawmaker Rui Matsukawa also joining us later this hour to look at the party's new direction. Much more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Take a look at how the Japanese yen is tracking after passing that 150 level against the U.S. dollar. Of course, it's been the election of Sanae Takaichi, who's seen as pro-stimulus, wanting for have easy money, and that really leading to downside pressure on the yen. Especially, we saw that record high or record low against the euro yesterday, and of course also the Aussie jumping to 10-month high against the Japanese yen as well. A senior economic advisor to Japan's Prime Minister in waiting, Sanae Takaichi, has told Bloomberg that the BOJ should hold off on a rate hike this month. Let's get more with Bloomberg Economics and government reporter Yoshiaki Nohara. Yoshi, so really reinforcing the view that the BOJ might get pressure to delay that rate hike that was very much expected in October.
Well, that was, as you said, somewhat expected. But what also in the interview, Avril Honda mentioned that he would accept a rate hike in December. So that tells that it's a situation very much different from the Abenomics when the Abenomics started and now, because now everybody is struggling with inflation.
Yoshiaki, it does seem like, based on who she set to give key posts to some of these veteran former finance ministers, reportedly, that there is some cognizance of the financial market reassurance aspect of all this. What do her potential picks tell us about her policy making?
Right. So as you mentioned that the two key positions are likely to go to former Prime Minister Taro Aso and also former Finance Minister Shunichi Suzuki. So those are kind of good signals that she is telegraphing to the market that she's not going to ignore the fiscal concerns people are having about her policy, and she's going to be responsible for fiscal policy. And that's a clear signal she's sending there.
Is it the right signal to send to the Japanese public that's been really tired of funding scandals and the LDP? This was supposed to be an election also to refresh the ruling party.
That is an excellent question, and one of the other things to keep in mind is that she's expected to appoint the Koichi Hagiuda to one of the key LDP positions, and he was one of the politicians who was implicated in the slush fund scandal, and that appointment can backfire. She's poorly testing the public, on this, so whether she can move on the scandal or public can still, mind about those kind of appointments when they are struggling with money, cost of inflation.
Bloomberg's economics and government reporter Yoshiaki Nohara with the latest on, of course, the Japanese government now starting to form its cabinet, but the yen really at those 2-month lows against the U.S. dollar. Options traders now the least bullish on the Japanese yen in more than 3 years. Joining us now is Shusuke Yamada, Chief Japan FX and Rate Strategist at BofA Global Research. Great to have you in the studio with us. I think I last saw you last year, I think. What do you make of the Japanese yen weakness? I mean, last week we're seeing a little bit of a spike because of uncertainty with the U.S. government shutdown, and that narrative seems to be completely gone.
Yes, so, the U.S. side still has some risks, but, obviously we had, development over the weekend. Takaichi has been pretty consistent on many things, but especially on fiscal expansion and easy monetary policy. Of course, there's a question how much she can deliver. Obviously, on the one hand, there's fiscal populism growing in the public. But on the other hand, she has to listen to the LDP's fiscal hawk, including Taro Aso. So I think given this uncertainty, I think yesterday's move was more measured, I would say. But because of this uncertainty, I think there's going to be more follow through. So that's negative for the yen. For the rest of the year, coupled with structural outflows we are seeing from Japan.
Not to mention that as a politician, she should listen to Japanese households who are feeling poorer as the Japanese yen gets cheaper. But what's your year-end target then for the yen? And could we see it recover into next year when we are expecting those BOJ rate hikes to come?
Yeah, so I think, for the rest of this year, we think, dollar yen will rise towards 155 by year end. So that goes against, I think, market expectation based on, monetary policy between, the U.S. and Japan. But, I think we still see outflows from Japan corporate FDI pretty strong. I think there's more for the market to price in terms of Takaichi's policy stance. And I would also say that the Fed pricing, I think, assumes continued softness in the U.S. labor market. But, the market still prices in more than 50% for BOJ hike by this year end. I see some inconsistency here. If the U.S. labor market remains weak, the bar for the BOJ to hike is high, especially because Takaichi will probably be a prime minister.
Yeah, and I think to your point also about expectation versus reality, since all the data, most of the data has been pointing in the right direction for the BOJ to continue normalization, we look at that yen weakness. You talk about 155 against the greenback. What are the risks for import inflation?
Yeah, so, import inflation has been a key issue in Japan, and that's why I think, the public want some change in policy. And I think, this risk will probably continue. I mean, in the financial market, we always think about, the central bank, policy actions will drive the currency. But I think in reality, these outflows from corporate and household are really based on demographics that has little to do with, monetary policy. So from that perspective, marginal change in the BOJ or the Fed policy rate will not impact dollar yen's direction that much. The move has to be much more drastic. So I think from this perspective, into next year, the key risk is that the Fed doesn't deliver rate cuts as much as priced. And if that's the case, I think Japan's import inflation will really get exacerbated.
What about Japan's potential investments into the U.S., direct investments potentially? I mean, how do you ascertain what the impact on FX is going to be then?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it's one of the key focus for investors after the U.S.-Japan investment deal in September. So, Japan already invests in the U.S. a lot. Japan's FDI is running at record high this year. The government explains they're going to fund this deal by the reserves and other measures that don't impact the FX market. But, these projects will probably involve private sector. Japanese companies could participate in certain projects. So that could generate more dollar demand. And, 550 billion is pretty big. But, I think once one project gets implemented, which is probably likely before the U.S. midterm election, then the market will extrapolate and think more will come. And that will have market implications.
Yeah, I mean, South Korea already saying that that could actually trigger a financial crisis if they, change everything into U.S. dollars and invest in the United States. When it comes to the yen, now record lows against the euro, Aussie also jumping to a 10-month high. Yen-funded carry trades. How attractive are they when the rest of the world also seems to be cutting? Bloomberg Economics just releasing their forecast of 15 major central banks out of 23 will be cutting rates into the year end. So does it become less attractive just because of the global funding and monetary environment?
At the margin, yes. But I think what's important is whether the Japanese corporate sector and investors increase the hedge ratio from here. Right now, I think the policy gap between the U.S. and Japan is still pretty high. I think it has to narrow within 3%, let's say. That will take at least several quarters, based on market pricing. I think until then, the Japanese outflows from the corporate and household will continue. And it's not really a speculative carry trade. It's really more about hedging against inflation, hedging against population decline. So I really don't think yen carry trade is crowded at the moment. So I think from that perspective, yen carry trade remains attractive for the time being.
Shusuke, just one final question for you. There's a continued concern about the long end, given what we might get from fiscal policies. There's a 30-year auction today, but at the same time, the finance ministry has also committed to curtailing supply throughout the year, the remainder of 2025. What do you see in balance as what we should be paying attention to in the curve?
Yes, so great question. And I think, the equity rally yesterday and the sell-off in the JGB yesterday basically tells the same thing, but, looking at from the different angles. So I think, Japan has the highest public to debt GDP ratio. But on the other hand, if you look at the debt to GDP ratio's movement over the past several years, Japan is the only major nation which had seen a massive improvement. So, what we have seen is a massive inflation tax to the people. So it's understandable that the people request more, fiscal spending. So I think, the question is whether the government can strike a right balance. Yesterday's move, I think, implies they can. Equity higher and the super long GGB's softness is more measured. But we really don't know how, the supplementary budget will play out in the fall and, also the general budget for the next fiscal year. So I think if this balance is sort of broken and, fiscal concern increases, there is, of course, a risk that, the super long GGB sell off further, and maybe that could cap equity rally. We just have to see how it plays out.
Shusuke Yamada, really good to see you in the studio. He's Chief Japan FX and Rate Strategist at BofA Global Research, and we do have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
President Trump says he would negotiate with Democrats over healthcare subsidies in a bid to resolve the U.S. government shutdown. The Senate has rejected for a fifth time a House-passed stopgap bill to keep the government open through November 21st. Democrats say they won't support the bill unless it addresses subsidies set to expire at the end of the year. After that vote, President Trump used a Truth Social post to blame Democrats for the impasse, while indicating he'd be open to talks after the government reopened.
We have a negotiation going on right now with the Democrats that could lead to very good things. And I'm talking about good things with regard to health care.
The uncertainty has certainly fueled demand for the safe haven precious metal. Earlier in the week, we were talking about 3,900. It's gone way past that now. 4,000 an ounce in its sight. We'll continue tracking that rally. This is Bloomberg.
First me, then them. Okay. Right, we have breaking news out of Japan. We are getting the household spending number, growth of 2.3% for the month of August year on year. This is a big beat from expectations, not to mention that it's an acceleration from previous growth of 1.4%. Remember, this is also a little bit backward looking because this was before we got the fine print of the U.S.-Japan trade deal, before Prime Minister Ishiba resigned, but still really showing resilience in Japanese consumption, especially given that we continue to see growing inflation, household spending year-on-year growth of 2.3%. Of course, inflation is one of the issues that the incoming prime minister will need to contend with. Let's actually get a little bit more about the election of Sanae Takaichi as the ruling party leader, the pro-stimulus conservative, facing the task of trying to not only contain inflation and really help the Japanese public, but reunite the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, regain public support, re-engage with a younger generation of voters. Joining us now is Rui Matsukawa, an LDP lawmaker who serves as a member of the House of Councillors. Really great to have you here in the Tokyo studio.
Yes, thank you.
So going into the election, we were seeing Koizumi and Takaichi neck and neck. What does it signal for the Japanese public and also for the global audience that Takaichi was elected as the party head?
I mean, this time election was a very interesting, exciting one because the first possible female leader versus first youngest leader for the Japanese history. So the people votes, I think, because the general public, it's not a general public because it's an election of the LDP president. So only the LDP members can vote. But other than the parliamentarian, the general member of the LDP members had much more votes for Takaichi-san. So I think it's affected a lot to the voting action by the congressman.
The LDP has had a very difficult election defeat among the Japanese public because of its challenges in refreshing itself. We're hearing from local media that perhaps former ministers like Taro Aso, Shinichi Suzuki could be becoming part of the cabinet again. Will this be sending the right message of change?
Well, it's one way to think because she's still under the forming the government. It's only one part of the post at the LDP headquarters. And she's now, I think, starting to think about the government's members. So we have to wait to see how it looks like because the more impression, the larger impression is given by, I think, the cabinet members rather than the headquarters LDP's post. So we'll see. And I think it's one way to think that she put up the important, kind of the experienced politicians in these posts to sort of show and reassure the stability of the financial policies, maybe.
Rui, this is Avril in Singapore. I just wanted your thoughts. I mean, to this point about change. Japan has gone through a number of prime ministers in the past couple of years. What needs to change for this continued certainty in the leadership in the country? How confident are you that maybe this time is different?
This time is different, I think. But first of all, I really would like to share the excitement. I'm very excited and happy to see the first female prime minister to be in the Japanese history all through. The glass ceiling is finally broken in Japan, even before the US, right? So it's a huge message to the Japanese society that, especially to the young women, that regardless of gender, or those who are not in the family of the politics or nothing to do with the politics can make a leadership of Japan. And that's sending a great message to the society in a positive manner. So I'm sure that this is a huge change that her election, the results has been, I think, brought into Japan.
Rui, is this more symbolic than anything, though, because we know of her as being relatively conservative? What progress are you actually expecting on women's issues?
Oh, You know what, compared with last year's election, she has put up more women's agenda, women's empowerment, women's health, or like supporting the families. I think she intentionally increased the women's agenda more so that she can be not just be seen as a leader of the conservative, but as also the women's leader.
Let's hope that some of those changes are actually reflected in government. But the fact that the LDP seems to be also turning more to the right. We know that one of her first election speeches, the campaign speeches, was about concerns about foreigners, I don't know, harassing deer or something like that. Is this a concern for the broader public when it comes to some of these issues where actually immigration is a big economic need here, given the demographics?
It is also, it is actually the concern for the general public, I have to say. The last election, the upper house election, we lost huge to a new party, the Sanseitou Party. How do you translate it in English? Participation Party, which was very strongly demonstrated about the concern of with regards to the foreign laborers or foreign people, immigration, and very much opposed. And then we lost huge. I think the part of the defeat of the LDP is due to those people who supported before LDP has been going to these parties. And it is true, like, it's great we have lots of tourists from foreign countries. Or like, as you said, we need labor because it's in a shortage in certain industries especially. But that's being said, at certain areas, like Kawasaki or maybe the Osaka's part of Osaka is some way visa is misused to hold, the building is occupied by certain countries' people, and then the money doesn't go to the Japanese, but to, circulated among these people. So people will feel like, oh, this is not Japan. Is this some other country? So there is a concern over the Japanese people with too much concentration of the foreign people in certain areas. And also the purchase of the land by the foreigners is also a concern.
Which, on the other hand, there have been also criticisms about Japan's foreign workers policies that the U.S. has determined just years ago that it was almost as forced labor because a lot of these immigrant workers didn't have the benefits of moving to other positions. They were just here temporarily and then sent away. That this was a way for cheap labor. So I guess the criticisms can go both ways. But when it comes to tensions, for example, within the country, especially the move to the right, this is also done in a diplomatic way. Are you concerned at all that if we see Yasukuni Shrine visits, that the diplomatic relations with Japan's neighbors could also be an issue?
But I think she has been very clear about her position with regards to Yasukuni Shrine visit. She says she didn't say she goes. She actually very reserved in a way to say that she will judge in an appropriate manner, which is the same language by the other candidates, and which means I think she will be very considerate about the diplomatic influence. I think the foreign neighboring countries do not need to worry about that part.
Rui Matsukawa, really good to have you in our Tokyo studio. Liberal Democratic Party lawmaker, of course, with the election of Sanae Takaichi as head of the ruling party. And of course, we're talking about those diplomatic concerns. We have seen Sanae Takaichi, of course, wanting more defense spending. In fact, defense remaining one of the top focus here in Japan. Investors jumping into plays expected to benefit from increased government spending under Sanae Takaichi's premiership. Shares of Mitsubishi Heavy, Japan Steelworks, and IHI all surging on Monday, given, of course, the election reaction here in Japan. And we're also seeing incredible growth in the defense startup sector. We talked about concerns with China, but also North Korea, Russia. Let's bring in politics and security reporter Alistair Gale for more on this. What's changed in a country that's traditionally been risk averse when it comes to these startups?
A lot has changed. Of course, Japan, like many other countries, is worried about the increasingly difficult security environment. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was, sent shockwaves to Japan. And around the world, there's more emphasis on defense spending, and Japan is increasing its defense budget. And part of having a strong defense industry is having that kind of innovation and having these smaller companies which come up with the new ideas as the nature of war changes. We've seen in Ukraine, drones have been a big part of that conflict. And Japan now wants to kind of encourage the growth of these small companies that can bring new ideas, can bring new concepts into the defense ecosystem. And for Japan to have really a robust kind of range of the big businesses like Mitsubishi Heavy, but also have the small companies as well.
Yeah, Alistair, I was about to ask you, what's the expectation of the extent in which these startups go on to contribute to Japan's defense?
Well, I mean, right now, it's a very small part of the defense ecosystem. Of course, in countries like the US, you have the startups which have grown very quickly, particularly in areas like drones. Japan is starting from a very small base. But the idea is that, over the years, over the decades, that they become more embedded in working with the defense ministry, working with larger companies, bringing new ideas. So it's starting from a very low level, but the point is that, Japan sees this as something which is essential to have a robust, kind of broad defense industry, not just focused on a few large companies.
But talking about that low base, is that some of the challenges to the success of these startups?
It is. Of course, the nature of startups is that they don't all succeed. In fact, many will fail. So there's also a cultural component to this. Japan is not a country traditionally which has embraced the kind of entrepreneurship. At least in recent decades, the risks that are involved in that is, something which is kind of relatively new for Japan. So I think what you'll see is, there'll be some companies which will succeed, but there'll be a lot that don't. And whether that process of regeneration, of coming back into the industry, bringing new ideas, is successful or not is something we need to kind of wait and see how it works. But really there's a thought now that that's essential to having a long-term sustainable defense industry here.
Bloomberg's Alistair Gill here with the latest on the startup environment here in Japan, especially in the defense sector. We have more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Checking some of the stocks to watch when trade opens in Japan shortly. Companies that operate throughout the semiconductor supply chain will be in focus after that AMD deal with OpenAI triggered a rally led by chip-related names. Keep an eye on Ibiden in particular, which is the most exposed Japanese stock to AMD. And of course, AMD CEO Lisa Su believes that their blockbuster deal with OpenAI to deploy 6 gigawatts of AI chips over multiple years is mutually beneficial. OpenAI President Greg Brockman also spoke to Bloomberg about the partnership and shared how his company plans to fund its massive projects.
You can really see that we're very much we just want compute, as much compute as possible. We think this is important for the economy. We think this is important for the nation. We think this is important for humanity. And so really we're working with everyone in this whole industry in order to get as much compute power online as quickly as we can.
Lisa, I'm sorry, specifics. Where is this data center going to be? Is it one single site? Is it Oracle that will partner with you on this?
Well, actually, what this really is an announcement of what AMD and OpenAI are going to do together. OpenAI has a lot of partners in terms of where they deploy. I imagine a lot of it will be in cloud service providers. It's really up to OpenAI and Greg and Sam and the team. But the way to think about it is for this amount of compute, it's going to have to be in a lot of different places. I mean, it's a massive amount.
Multiple locations.
Multiple locations. Right? I would imagine, multiple providers to really get this online as fast as possible.
Greg, there is a lot of focus on where OpenAI is going to get the money from to fund all of this. Sam Altman's big picture commitment is well documented, right? And the numbers are, to his mind, are in the trillions. But have you specifically thought about debt financing for this relationship with AMD? Have you thought about doing a specific equity raise? You are very committed across multiple projects.
Yeah, look, the way that I would look at this is that AI revenue is growing faster than I think almost any product in history, and that ultimately, at the end of the day, the reason this compute power is so important, is so worthwhile for everyone to build, is because the revenue ultimately will be there. Now, as a company that is trying to move as fast as we can, we look at everything, right? We look at equity, debt, we look at trying to find creative ways of financing all of this. That's been actually a huge focus of us for the past couple of years, is thinking about how can we possibly build the amount of compute that is required in order to really transform this whole economy into an AI-powered economy. And so I think you'll see lots of creative ideas, but fundamentally, I think at the end of the day, it is because we believe that
I'm sorry to jump in and interrupt, and Caro, just forgive me on this one. The condition of AMD issuing the stock to OpenAI requires you to spend money, basically, because you have to deliver that gigawatt of capacity first. Lisa, I have to ask you if you have assurances that OpenAI is good for it.
Well, let me be clear. I mean, this deal is a win for AMD, it's a win for OpenAI, and it's a win for our shareholders. And that's kind of the way we put this together. I have full confidence in OpenAI, Sam, Greg, Sarah. I mean, this is a massive opportunity for us. Right now, right here, it's about who has the most compute and how fast can we get it online. And we're committing to doing this together.
AMD CEO Lisa Su and OpenAI President Greg Brockman speaking with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. And of course, we saw the incredible move on AMD, gaining more than 20% on inking that deal with OpenAI. But Avril, is just the mention by OpenAI at its annual developers event that sends stocks soaring across the board. We're talking about random companies that are merely mentioned because they will be incorporated as apps into, for example, ChatGPT. For example, we had HubSpot climbing more than 2%, Figma jumping more than 7%. These are mostly named as partners. The apps will be incorporated into ChatGPT, the AI bot that counts some 800 million weekly users. So we are seeing the moves and the influence that OpenAI is just having on this AI exuberance and anything that is mentioned together with its name.
Yeah, and the influence of a private company, $500 billion in valuation, yes, but how it is really sending these ripple effects into the stock market. So it's becoming a whale in the stock market that it once shunned. And on top of that, you think back as well to last week, right, when its announcement of an instant buy option in ChatGPT also sent e-commerce firms such as Shopify and Etsy soaring. So certainly more of that impact that you're seeing this week as well on the likes of AMD, but certainly reminds you of NVIDIA's golden touch as well. You think back to that NVIDIA event last year, the mere mention by Jensen Huang of some of the companies, including Cadence Design, Ansys, and we saw their shares really surging. Now, on that deal, OpenAI COO Brad Lightcap says the company is incredibly constrained in its compute power, and deals such as the one with AMD will help build out more capacity. He also told us about the importance of investing ahead to keep pace with demand.
We are tremendously compute constrained. It feels like we're in this kind of recurring theme of being compute constrained, and I think the reason for that is the answer to the question you asked, which is demand.
Right.
We see there are multiples of demand that are latent and untapped from what we have today, and even today, obviously, by any standard, demand and revenue growth has been torrid in its pace. And so really we have to invest ahead of that. And I think that's going to be the rate limiter for us to be able to go capture demand, whether it's consumer or enterprise, and for us to be able to build new models, parallelize more experiences, more product experiences, and then enable users specifically to be able to use those products more actively in their daily life, at work, and at home. And so, even things like Sora, the app we just launched, we wish we could invite more people onto it now, but we just need more compute. So the AMD deal, we're excited about being, directionally a way for us to do that.
I've got to ask about the report that OpenAI closed secondary, or the ability for employees to sell shares at a $500 billion valuation. I already asked you this question, but what is the metric we're supposed to judge your success by? The $500 billion valuation, the 6 billion tokens per minute? To you, Brad, what is it?
For me, it's actually kind of a metric that we talked about is tokens. It's you mentioned 6 billion tokens per minute on our API. That is the purest, for me, the kind of essence of utility is that consumption metric. And so we actively track that metric to see how people's consumption of AI is growing over time. And you see this happen in amazing ways. So things like Codex, for example, we've seen grow 10x since August, purely on consumption of tokens around coding. And you start to see that same pattern emerge across multiple lanes of use and across multiple areas of work. And that's the metric I look at, because if that number is going up, it means people are using us for more things, and that's the ultimate goal.
OpenAI COO Brad Lightcap speaking to Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow at OpenAI's Development Day in San Francisco. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. We're watching sovereign debt today. JGB's underperforming, treasuries on the long end underperforming as well, really to do with fiscal concerns. And where can you see this the most? In France, French markets really tumbling after the resignation of another prime minister. The CAC 40 seeing the most losses in about 6 weeks. Banks taking the biggest hit. The euro also falling to 1 week low. And you can see French bonds also falling, and that premium over Germany at around this year's highs, Avril.
Yeah, Shery, take a look at some of the other stories we're tracking. CBOE Global Markets winning regulatory approval to host share listings in Australia, setting up a challenge to the nation's dominant exchange ASX. And the decision allows IPOs on CBOE Australia, threatening to end the ASX's local market domination. And this move follows years of hitches at the ASX, including a failed tech upgrade that triggered a sweeping probe into its governance and risk controls. Bloomberg's been told that Tesla plans to launch a cheaper version of the Model Y on Tuesday as it moves to counter the loss of U.S. EV incentives. Sources say the new model is what the company's been teasing in social media posts since the weekend. We're told the cheaper cars will have fewer features and use less premium materials to offset the loss of the federal tax credit worth up to $7,500. The sovereign wealth funds of Abu Dhabi, Norway and Singapore have become anchor investors in LG Electronics' Indian unit. Money managers, including BlackRock and Fidelity, also bought anchor shares as part of the company's $1.3 billion IPO. LG will start taking orders from public investors on Tuesday and expects to list on October 14. Markets open in Tokyo are next. This is Bloomberg.
This is the Asia Trade. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens and what could be another big day for tech. Avril, given that we have seen really semiconductors on fire in the previous session on Wall Street, and all of this to do with another big budget data center agreement, AMD and OpenAI inking that deal. Of course, we have seen the huge rally with NVIDIA as well, so we'll be watching the tech sector across Asia.
Certainly. Also watching sovereign debt, Shery. We do have that 30-year auction out of Japan today. Those concerns about what fiscal policy from the LDP Sanae Takaichi is going to mean for the curve. We are already seeing some moves elsewhere, including in France, Shery.
Yeah, given fiscal concerns in France with another prime minister having to resign, of course, and we're coming off the back also of the long-end treasuries underperforming the markets. We had already seen JGB yields, especially in the long end, 30-year, 40-year, 20-year is really spiking across the board. So take a look right now on how we're coming online with the 10-year yield at 169 right now, and the Japanese yen continuing to weaken past that 150 level, and the Nikkei continuing its surge to record highs up 0.7%. And as I said, it'll be really about the tech sector. Ibiden, for example, one that has the most exposure when it comes to Japan to AMD. And we already had household data also surprising to the upside, perhaps giving some more indication that the BOJ might be firmly on its normalization path. But at the same time, we got one of the most close economic advisors to Takaichi talking about how it might be difficult for a BOJ rate hike in October, also leading to some skepticism in the markets, Avril.
Yeah, we also have that bit of political uncertainty with that U.S. government shutdown stretching on, and that has really fueled gold. We're looking at 4,000, almost 4,000 an ounce in its sights at the moment on the precious metal. But of course, that has also led to some moves in treasuries. It's interesting, you had the likes of Morgan Stanley talking about how if yields actually climb this week, we should be piling more into treasuries. Think about how what's going on in Japan and France. I think one of our analysts actually characterized it as somehow the U.S. curve turning into an oasis of calm amid all this. Looking at the last trade as well, worth noting, we did see the S&P 500 going from strength to strength. There was that tech-fueled rally. There's lots to unpack. Let's bring in Kieran, Calder, head of Asia Equity Research at UBP. Kieran, great to see you.
Morning.
So what we're seeing overnight in AMD and OpenAI, it's really sprinkling its magic once again. It's looking a lot like NVIDIA in its golden touch. What could possibly go wrong?
We agree that there's really only one theme. Well, there's more than one, but the main theme is the expansion of AI infrastructure, and that's being led, ironically, by the company that's not listed itself, OpenAI. So, we've seen a number of these sort of deals over the last weeks and months, and we'll probably see more. What could go wrong? I guess so. Two things. One, after performance of the listed companies, even OpenAI's private market valuation, we need to start to see monetization on top of that infrastructure build out, and we're not going to see that for a while. And then secondly, valuations. Valuations are priced for perfection, so that's always a bit of a risk, although the underlying story is still strong, we think.
It's also raising this chatter about circular financing again. What do you make of that?
Yeah. It used to be called vendor financing. Yes, this is also an issue. I guess part of the, OpenAI has all the money. Oracle has a lot of money, helping to fuel that demand. Helping to fuel that infrastructure build out. If they see the demand on the other side, this is what we all have to cross our fingers and hope that, they're right. But absolutely, this is a feature of this expansion.
Given, of course, the expansion in AI infrastructure across Asia as well, would utilities be a big win, especially here in Japan, given that we have Sanae Takaichi, who's also pro-nuclear, that has sent shares higher in the previous session as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we think, while our biggest overweight is tech on the back of the earnings story that we just talked about, being led by AI infrastructure build out. A more sort of defensive way to play that for us, we think, is utilities. The power demand coming on the back of increased AI is massive. Just yesterday, you had NTT at their Investor Day talk about in Japan, they expect AI power demand within 5 years to surpass the power demand for all of Tokyo in just 2 years ago. So there's two ways to tackle that. One is build out more infrastructure, which takes time, and re-firing nuclear plants may be part of that in the case of Japan or in other geographies as well. But another way is to reduce or improve efficiency of the existing power demand infrastructure. So we definitely think that's a theme. Yesterday, defense and utilities were strong. These are the initial reaction to the new LDP leader, and we think the moves in the yen also quite interesting. She's expected to produce a fiscal budget, or special budget. Ironically, the issue that the BOJ is facing is inflation, and a weaker yen is also obviously exacerbates imported inflation. But this is where we are. So it would be quite a surprise now, I think, if the BOJ didn't move later on this month.
So you're expecting the BOJ to move later this month, given imported inflation. I mean, we just had BofA expecting 155 yen per dollar, given where the government could head from here as well. Will that help in the stock market incredible rally we're seeing record after record, or will BOJ normalization put a damper on it?
Well, so I think we're not talking about massive rate increases. In Japan, we go at 10s at a time, or possibly 25 at the outside. But certainly the inflation picture, outside of the LDP picture as of the weekend, points to the BOJ has to get a handle on inflation, and imported inflation, particularly around food, is a big issue for Japanese households. So if we don't move later this month, the perception will be that there's a bit of wanting to please the new incoming prime minister from the BOJ, and that probably wouldn't be taken that positively. In terms of the market's being driven by the AI infrastructure story, and that's a little bit not so sensitive to inflation and interest rates at the moment.
Kieran, where does all this leave banking stocks in Japan then?
Yeah, so I mean, the bank stocks in Japan, obviously the best play on the widening curve. So we think there's a possibility that the BOJ would try to peg the 10 and 2 in terms of a new sort of yield curve control regime, and let the long rate be more market driven. If we can get a decent spread in the curve, then that would be good for bank earnings. But at the moment, and certainly banks have been a leader in terms of the corporate governance play in Japan long before the topics or the JPX got involved in it. Long been a leader in terms of shareholder returns, improving dividends, et cetera. And almost half their balance sheet is outside of Japan as well. So it's a pretty good play on global growth. So we still like the banks in Japan.
All right, Kieran, great to get your insights. Thanks so much. Kieran Calder is head of Asia Equity Research at UBP. Shery?
And Avril, as we continue to follow that AI frenzy, of course, we are watching Ibiden and other Japanese tech names, Ibiden especially because it's the most exposed to AMD, 11% of the revenue coming from this company. Let's get more details with Bloomberg Intelligence Global Head of Technology Research, Mandeep Singh, when it comes to this OpenAI deal with the company, the latest big budget data center agreement this year. How significant is this agreement?
I mean, look, right now the AI infrastructure build-out was led by all the hyperscalers, your Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. Now it feels like OpenAI wants to become a hyperscaler themselves, which is why they had that deal with NVIDIA first and now with AMD, and they also have a deal with Broadcom. So pretty much they are diversifying their bets when it comes to who they source the chips from. But at the end of the day, they want to be at the same scale as the hyperscalers and not rely on, the cloud providers to give them the compute here.
Just in terms of the compute capacity, this, of course, follows on from what we got with NVIDIA. What does this tell us about this ecosystem build-out that it's now between the U.S. and China? What do you see in terms of tech dominance?
Well, so when you look at the large language model companies, the top models are still dominated by the ones here in the U.S. At the same time, the inference costs are coming into play more and more given the scale that we are talking about. And so from that perspective, whether it was DeepSeek at the start of the year or some of the other models, they can be deployed at a much cheaper price compared to the U.S. LLM companies that they are, that are deploying the infrastructure right now. So at one point, everyone will start to care about the prices when it comes to what the current wave of AI demands. But right now, it's about gaining the market share. And when you look at the IT services or, some of the industries that can benefit from productivity driven by AI, there is a pretty large market out there that can benefit from, deployment of AI here in the U.S.
Mandeep Singh, BI's Global Head of Technology Research, always good to have you with us. Thank you as we continue to watch those tech shares. We're also watching Sumitomo Realty here in Japan. It's gaining more than 4.5% at the moment. Now, Bloomberg has learned that Elliott has approached several Japanese companies about buying their share in order to ramp up pressure on the real estate developer to boost value. The companies that Elliott approached hold no more than around 5% of Sumitomo Realty shares. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Here are some of the top global headlines that we're following at the moment. President Trump says he would negotiate with Democrats over health care subsidies in a bid to resolve the U.S. government shutdown. The Senate has rejected for a fifth time a House-passed stopgap bill to keep the government open through November 21st. Democrats say they won't support the bill unless it addresses subsidies set to expire at the end of the year. After that vote, President Trump used a Truth Social post to blame Democrats for the impasse, while indicating he'd be open to talks after the government reopened. President Trump says a 25% tariff on medium and heavy-duty trucks will begin from November 1. The levies were due to start in October. That timeline slipped as officials heard appeals from companies concerned about the impact. The duties threaten an industry already feeling impacts from tariffs on steel and aluminum, as well as tighter environmental regulations. White House AI chief David Sachs says it's essential for the U.S. to dominate in AI, defending the Trump administration's approach to China. Speaking to Bloomberg, Sachs stood by the decision to let NVIDIA and AMD sell less advanced AI chips to China.
We need to be pro-innovation, we need to be pro-infrastructure and pro-energy, and we need to be pro-export so that the American technology stack dominates the world.
And of course, we've been watching AI-related stocks in the session. But aside from that, it's really about this political turmoil in France, having lost yet another prime minister. We saw pressure on the euro against the greenback. We saw the premium that investors demand to hold French debt versus German debt climbing to the highest in about a year. And of course, French stocks also slid overnight. For more on the French political turmoil, Bloomberg managing editor Jill Deesis joins me now in the Singapore studio. Jill, really good to have you in the Lion City. Not so good, I guess, if you are French, because you're losing yet another prime minister. You have political deadlock expected. Put things in perspective for us.
Yes, Avril. I mean, this has really just been a complete disaster for Macron's government. A really ill-fated calculation when he put together a cabinet that essentially consisted of a lot of centrist loyalists, really upsetting two of the main coalitions that he really needs to bring together to actually have his centrist minority government operate, that being sort of the more centrist left and the more centrist right. So the position that we're left in right now is you've got this outgoing prime minister, Macron, who's barely in the position, although I don't think that he would have lasted that much longer, because a lot of those lawmakers are really preparing to put together a no confidence vote in the event that he even tried to stay on. But now you're in this position where he's got about 48 hours to try to bring these different sides to the table. I think that's going to be really, really difficult for this government, and that essentially leaves Macron with very few options other than to try to appoint another prime minister who's going to face a lot of the same issues over dealing with the budget. You've got you could call a legislative election where you potentially are giving more far-right nationalist parties the opportunity to gain more power, or he could resign, which Macron has said that he wouldn't do.
So we could very well be in this position again following these latest moves. Talk to us about what's at the heart of the issue, right? Because we keep coming back to the same thing, unpopular policies about spending, about taxation.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, you're really looking at, within the euro area, the economy that has, the largest budget deficit. So really, really severe concerns over the budget. We've seen with the other two prime ministers that Macron had appointed was essentially this issue of not being able to bring all of these coalitions to the table and get something over the line that, includes, first of all, these really unpopular spending cuts, but also higher taxes. So there really hasn't been something that brings all of that to the table together. I think the problem that Macron has is that, as the centrist minority government here, you're trying to bring together coalitions that really just don't see eye to eye. I think a lot of this stems to this really, really ill-fated decision last year in 2024 to pull a snap election that obviously saw him lose further popularity. And so now he's in a really, really difficult position where he's trying to form this government where you've just got the left and the right that do not want to interact with each other, don't see eye to eye on a lot of issues, and he's left in the middle here with, again, very, very few options to make something actually work.
And Jill, you can see already the market reaction, right? I mean, it was just before when we had French bonds being seen as a haven, and you have 10-year yields now at the highest levels in the euro area. What are the economic implications and credit rating implications for the country now?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point we've already seen some credit downgrades, right, when it comes to France. What the big issue here is this inability to really get a budget together. I think there's a deadline coming up next week. It could be very well that the government has to pull in some emergency powers before heading toward a potential shutdown by January. So, again, a lot of issues here that ultimately kind of leave this government incapable of actually governing. And I think obviously that's leading to additional political uncertainty and instability. I mean, in the event that there is another legislative election that would have to happen, I believe, within the next 20 to 40 days or so, depending on when that's called. Or, again, if Macron ultimately does decide to resign, which, I do have to say he said that he wouldn't do, that could also lead to some pretty, significant turnover within the French government, including the potential for a new president earlier than anticipated. So, again, I think all of that instability, that uncertainty over when a French budget is actually put together is leading to this kind of reaction and ultimately, again, just a really clouded future here.
So for now, Jill, all eyes on France in the Eurozone, but there's also this broader geopolitical backdrop, right? You talk about these tariff risks and how Euro leaders are engaging with the U.S. What are you seeing in terms of, things playing out here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this kind of goes back to, what we've been really seeing over the past year leading up to Trump being inaugurated in the United States earlier this year, is that you've got a lot of uncertainty over what's happening in some of the world's most critical economies, including within the EU, an incredibly important trading bloc for the U.S., but also really, an ally for the U.S., right? And so when you've got that political instability, that uncertainty about who's leading these governments, it really does raise a lot of questions over what the tariff regime, the relationship with the United States looks like. I mean, we're already seeing, Avril, in a lot of other places, the idea of certain countries trying to renegotiate even tariffs. I mean, look at Japan, for example. The likely new Prime Minister Takaichi coming in saying that there's certain aspects of that trade deal with the United States that Japan may want to renegotiate. I think, you could apply some similar concepts and ideas to, some of these other places where, depending on who ultimately may come in and, really control some of these governments, whether that be in the legislature or in some of these, more heads of state positions, I think it raises a lot of questions about how exactly the world interacts with the Trump administration in the United States, when that administration has spent so much time really sort of changing how trade and economy works.
Jill, always great to chat. Thank you so much. Bloomberg Managing Editor Jill Desis. We'll have more heads on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Take a look at the tech sector across Japan, especially chips, given that we are seeing some green on the board. Advanta is gaining more than 2%, Disco up more than 3%, and Ibiden, which is the most exposed to AMD, 11% of their revenue coming from the company, also gaining slightly, as we heard about that deal with OpenAI on another big budget data center agreement this year. AMD CEO Lisa Su believing that that this agreement with OpenAI to deploy 6 gigawatts of AI chips over multiple years is mutually beneficial. OpenAI President Greg Brockman also spoke to Bloomberg about the partnership and shared how his company plans to fund its massive projects.
You can really see that we're very much in the we just want compute, as much compute as possible. We think this is important for the economy. We think this is important for the nation. We think this is important for humanity. And so really we're working with everyone in this whole industry in order to get as much compute power online as quickly as we can.
Lisa, I'm sorry, specifics. Where is this data center going to be? Is it one single site? Is it Oracle? That will partner with you on this?
Well, actually, what this really is an announcement of what AMD and OpenAI are going to do together. OpenAI has a lot of partners in terms of where they deploy. I imagine a lot of it will be in cloud service providers. It's really up to OpenAI and Greg and Sam and the team. But the way to think about it is for this amount of compute, it's going to have to be in a lot of different places. I mean, it's a massive amount.
Multiple locations.
Multiple locations. Right? I would imagine, multiple providers to really get this online as fast as possible.
Greg, there is a lot of focus on where OpenAI is going to get the money from to fund all of this. Sam Altman's big picture commitment is well documented, right? And the numbers, to his mind, are in the trillions. But have you specifically thought about debt financing for this relationship with AMD? Have you thought about doing a specific equity raise? You are very committed across multiple projects.
Yeah, look, the way that I would look at this is that AI revenue is growing faster than I think almost any product in history, and that ultimately, at the end of the day, the reason this compute power is so important, is so worthwhile for everyone to build, is because the revenue ultimately will be there. Now, as a company that is trying to move as fast as we can, we look at everything, right? We look at equity, debt. We look at trying to find creative ways of financing all of this. That's been actually a huge focus of us for the past couple of years, is thinking about how can we possibly build the amount of compute that is required in order to really transform this whole economy into an AI-powered economy. And so I think you'll see lots of creative ideas, but fundamentally, I think at the end of the day, it is because we believe that
I'm sorry to jump in and interrupt, and Caro, just forgive me on this one. The condition of AMD issuing the stock to OpenAI requires you to spend money, basically, because you have to deliver that gigawatt of capacity first. Lisa, I have to ask you if you have assurances that OpenAI is good for it.
Well, let me be clear. I mean, this deal is a win for AMD, it's a win for OpenAI, and it's a win for our shareholders. And that's kind of the way we put this together. I have full confidence in OpenAI, Sam, Greg, Sarah. I mean, this is a massive opportunity for us. Right now, right here, it's about who has the most compute and how fast can we get it online. And we're committing to doing this together.
AMD CEO Lisa Su and OpenAI President Greg Brockman speaking with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Now let's take a look at what risk assets are doing, because we have been seeing Bitcoin pulling back a little following a 2-day rally. Of course, it has been fueled by dollar debasement trade as well as the risk rally. What's also interesting is if you look at options, that traders are pricing in that moderate increase of protection for a pullback. But that also squares away with the expectations that towards the end of the year, they think we could see 140,000 just based on what we're seeing in options contracts. We'll continue tracking that. More ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Take a look at how Japanese assets are trading early in the Asia session. We continue to see a weak Japanese yen past that 150 level against the U.S. dollar after the election of Sanae Takaichi to head the ruling LDP. We're following JGBs very closely because we do have a very consequential 30-year auction, which will test investor demand, of course, at a time when we have seen long-end yields spike on concerns about fiscal expansion. The Nikkei gaining 0.6%, continuing to be at record high. ties. All of this to do with the election of Sanae Takaichi, of course, over the weekend. Bloomberg opinion columnist Gearoid Reidy thinks that Japan's incoming leader is generating buzz and misinformation in equal measure. He joins us now. Gearoid, good to have you with us. Of course, Sanae Takaichi is portrayed as a right-winger, as a person who will lead to more pro-stimulus measures. Is this an accurate characterization of the incoming leader?
Certainly, I think it's beyond accurate to portray her as right-wing. There's no doubt in my mind that she is right-wing. What I'm kind of touching on in the piece, I guess, is the portrayals that go a little bit further beyond that to try to portray her, I should say, as some sort of radical, as some sort of ultra-conservative. And I think when it comes to the markets, the same things apply. We saw this when Abe, a lot of this is going back to the late Shinzo Abe, and when he came in, he also got a lot of these portrayals is that he was some sort of dangerous radical simply because he came from, the right of the LDP. But you're also seeing this, I think, in the markets where Takaichi maybe is benefiting from expectations that her economic program will look a lot like Abe's. And I think the situation is very different because Abe had a great hand to play when he came into power. He, won the election, had a huge majority in Parliament, and he also had people who were crying out for big ideas and big action. Takaichi doesn't have that. She has a minority in both houses of Parliament, and she has to make deals with other opposition parties if she wants to get anything done, much less anything as radical as Abenomics was.
Yeah, and during her acceptance speech, to get things done, she said she's going to work. So channeling her inner Rihanna, as you highlighted in your opinion piece. But what is this vibe shift going to mean for Japan?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that you saw was that anecdote that you mentioned there where, she wasn't in power for 5 minutes before there was a controversy over allegedly, hinting towards overwork. So she said she was going to work, as you said, and then she said she was going to throw away the phrase work-life balance. And immediately people leapt on that and tried to suggest that she wanted everyone in the country to be working themselves to the bone. She was talking, of course, to the lawmakers and politicians who have been letting down the rank-and-file members of the LDP over the past year and more by not winning elections. So you can expect some kind of controversies for that. There is, however, there is a vibe shift, as you say. I think we're seeing kind of, there's definitely a break with certainly Ishiba, who I see is displayed on screen there at the moment, and also with Kishida, who was more of within the LDP. He was on the center left of the LDP, still obviously on the right wing in general. This is a shift way back to the right wing of the LDP. And I think you will see a lot of things, a lot of ideas shift now. But as I say, whether Takaichi can actually get anything done or not is the real question. And her first challenge is to even preserve the coalition that she has at the moment, the long-standing coalition between the LDP and Komeito. Noises coming out of Komeito suggest they're not very happy with it at all. So that puts her in a bit of a precarious position before we've even installed her as prime minister.
And a precarious position perhaps with the markets as well, because I mentioned the consequential 30-year JGB auction that's coming up. Of course, we know that Takaichi is a fan of Margaret Thatcher, but you've also questioned the fears about her turning into Liz Truss instead.
Yes, I think when it comes to, when it comes to that analogy, obviously the bond market situation is very different in Japan and the UK in terms of, who actually holds most of the bonds. She's going to have to be careful, though, as she lays out her economic plans. We actually didn't hear a great deal in detail from her about, a broader vision for the country this time compared to her previous previous runs at LDP president, where she was far more cautious. She was far more cautious this time, I should say, compared to previous times when she has advocated, big spending, easy money. If she starts to roll out some ideas like that, then you could see, the bond markets getting spooked. At the same time, as I say, she is very constrained at the moment, and I think she realizes that the first thing that she needs to do are things that are going to be quickly felt by the public that is very unhappy with sustained inflation. So I think the first months, assuming that she is installed as Prime Minister next week, they're going to be very much focused on making sure, trying to pass some legislation that is going to get money into the wallets of hard-hit consumers and hard-hit everyday households.
And we'll continue to track whether there's a bit of a gap between expectation and reality in policy making. Gearoid, great to get your insights on this, and I'd suggest everyone read about his opinion piece on the Terminal. Bloomberg opinion columnist Gearoid Reidy for us. Now let's take a look at how all this is playing out in FX, right? We've been seeing how the yen has been coming under a lot of pressure, including on the euro and the greenback. Our Bloomberg FX and rate strategist David Finity joins us now for more. So, David, Gearoid is just talking to us about the policy-making aspect of all this. We have been seeing cash and options markets kind of adjusting to this shift. How high do you think this takes things on dollar yen?
I think it's interesting because yesterday you saw certainly the knee-jerk reaction high in dollar yen. It went basically up 2% to mid 150 to 151 area, and basically, but some of that was definitely funds buying dollar yen, entering long positions, no doubt about that. But actually, a lot of it was actually just funds squaring up short positions or existing short positions that they held ahead of the LDP election. So the question is, those funds themselves, they didn't exit the short position and then go long. They've just gone squared up. So what that does mean is that while there are some people who are bullish on dollar yen, there's a lot of funds now who are basically on the sort of sidelines trying to go, okay, well, we squared up our position because we had to because dollar yen rose, but they're not like, well, that just means that we'll enter dollar yen positions. So if they were to, they'll obviously be a lot more bullish for dollar yen. But the question for them is like what Gearoid's indicated. What does this actually mean in reality for policy going forward? You saw yesterday one of Takaichi's advisors actually came out and said, look, maybe not an October rate hike for BOJ, but maybe a December rate hike. So then you saw dollar yen actually dip back below 150 on that news. So the question is, yes, there's an idea that there will be more stimulus. Yes, there is an idea that she will lead to slower BOJ rate hikes. But the question is that what happens in reality is going to be the question. And at the moment, the jury's a bit out on that. It's waiting to see what he wants to do. So dollar yen can certainly go higher from here, but it really needs these people on the sidelines to say, okay, Takaichi's, what her policies actually are going to mean that there will be slower BOJ policies, definitely. It will mean that there will be a lot more debt issued, and I think if that's the case, dollar yen pushes higher, particularly if the Fed sort of says that 2 cuts is the most we'll do. But as I said, at the moment, quite a few of the traders are saying we haven't seen enough clarity yet to pick that out. Deutsche Bank themselves yesterday went from sort of bullish dollar yen just to neutral. So look, we need more clarity, and I think that's where the market's, a lot of traders are at the moment trying to work out.
Is it too early then to say that the yen-funded carry trades are back in action, given, of course, where rates globally could be headed as well? And the fact that, as you said, given that we have no clarity on Takaichi's policy, BOJ policy, could that also perhaps risk the sort of spike that we saw in the yen last year when the BOJ actually hiked rates?
I think going to the carry trade part of it, I think that's always been in play. The yen's always been a popular carry trade for at least some investors. And I think a lot of real money funds, when you saw dollar yen in this 146 to 148 in the summer tug of war, basically, really what was going on there, you had real money funds going, look, we'll just take the carry. Hedge funds were trying to sell dollar yen on a variety of measures. And so you had this tug of war going on. But behind that, said real money funds were like, hey, we like the carry because yen is still, the interest rates are still cheap, certainly compared to US, with the Fed in no real hurry to slash by 50 basis points, shall we say. So that trade's already been going on. I think the question now is, does it get added to? And I think there certainly is a case for that, because, say, look, the Fed, we have a slew of Fed speakers this week. If they do come out and say, look, 2 is the maximum we'll do this year, then, or maybe even 1, then obviously that's sort of dollar supportive. And as I said, with the BOJ, if they're not going to hike till December, people will say, look, I've still got a decent interest rate differential, so let's do the carry trade. So from a real money perspective, real funds, I think they'll go, I like that. I think the question is, the hedge funds do that? And I think the attempt to do it short term, there's worry about, said, how does the BOJ actually play out? Because you could get those near-term reactions if the BOJ was to actually cut rates in October, which would be a surprise now, because the market's only looking for about 16% chance, rate hike in October, because the market's only looking for about 16% chance of it happening.
David, you talk about tug of wars. Do you think that what we're seeing in France and the euro can potentially help to cap some of this yen weakness?
To some degree. I mean, the yen as the idea of a safe haven trade, that had sort of diminished at the moment. Again, given this uncertainty of how Takaichi can play out. For the safe haven trades, a lot of people have sort of said, let's go to gold, let's go to Bitcoin, let's go to silver, because they're not worried about debt issuance or other factors. So one thing that was interesting on the euro yesterday, when obviously the developments in France, that the Prime Minister resigned, and now he has an initial 48 hours, but on the news of resignation, you did see euro, certainly dollar dip, but talking to contacts in London, they said that we haven't seen a major flow of outflow of, there are a lot of dollar euro longs. They didn't initially get flushed out on that move. So I think the euro long is still a popular trade at the moment. Again, depending on how these developments play out, that could certainly change, because again, you don't need a lot of unwinding to spur even more unwinding, and that could flow something into the yen. But I think for the yen, you may need more equities be a bigger play for them to really tank. At the moment, equities grinding higher. So this safe haven play, the market's going, well, what safe haven play? There is risk on at the moment.
And
so
as we watch these cross-asset moves, it's also worth noting we're seeing the 30-year yield rising to a fresh record 3.315% ahead of that auction later today. David, great to chat. Thank you so much, Bloomberg FX and rate strategist David Finnerty. Now let's take a look at how some of the haven plays are doing, because gold has gone from strength to strength. We are now seeing 4,000 an ounce in its sights, and this is really fueling the commodity-heavy market of Australia. That's been doing well because of the gold surge to these records. So that is actually set to become Australia's second most valuable commodity export, potentially overtaking LNG, and could also help to offset declines in revenues from some of these other commodities that haven't been doing as well, including iron ore. For the moment, though, we are seeing the ASX 200 looking a little soft. That's something we're going to be tracking in the session. Coming up, a deeper dive into the fallout from the fatal 000 outage as pressure mounts for Optus and its parent company, Singtel, to address reputational damage and restore customer confidence. We're going to be talking more about Australia, all that and more. This is Bloomberg. Australia's communications minister will meet today with the country's 3 major mobile network companies following a series of outages, including failures of the emergency 000 call system. That system is run by Optus, a subsidiary of Singapore's Singtel. A 13-hour 000 outage last month blocked hundreds of emergency calls and has been linked to 3 deaths. Bloomberg Intelligence says Optus risks losing market share to rivals as public distrust in the health of its network grows. Joining us now from Melbourne is Helen Bird, Senior Law Lecturer at Swinburne University. Really good to have you with us. It is an unfortunate turn of events. I think your sense is it might have been one that could have been prevented. Talk us through how things got so bad.
Well, I guess we have to go back a little bit in time because the first major outage that occurred that we're discussing, it was back in 2023. And at the time, Optus was called to account for that, and the CEO of Optus stood down. 2 years on, in 2025, there was another outage, and this time it was linked to 3 deaths. I think it's important to say that Optus is not the only carrier that has failed its 000 service. The other large carrier is Telstra, and it's had problems as well. So we have to accept that outages occur. The complaint here is with the way in which it was managed and the response that was taken in dealing with that outage, which just simply took too long and has caused a lot of problems, both reputational and regulatory, for Optus.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions as well about accountability, even after those previous episodes, Helen. What is your sense of the safeguards that should be put in place, and can they be put in place?
Well, I like to sort of say regulation of this field, which is telecommunications, has what we call carrots and sticks. When I talk about sticks, I mean things that the government can impose that have the dire consequences that if you don't follow them, you're going to be punished. So in a sense, they seek to deter misconduct. And how you might do that is you can impose penalties for failing to provide a safe system of 000 outage. You can also set up an industry ombudsman. And both of those are things that the government is doing at the moment. But honestly, they're not short-term considerations. The government has to actually find someone to be the ombudsman and set up the infrastructure to do it. And they've also yet to determine what are the obligations that they'll require the telcos to follow that are imposed by the ombudsman. And finally, what penalties will be imposed. So we're talking 6 to 12 months, but they're all sticks that work in deterring people from misconduct. The alternative method is to look at the carrots. That is, what are the incentives that drive this company to succeed? And really what we're saying is that help it to make its profit. And the short answer to that is that they're licensed to be a carrier. So the government already has that. They've given a licence to Optus and to Telstra and to TPG, who are the Australian major carriers. And what we're saying is it's possible to now put some conditions on how they operate on that licence, and we could have immediate effect. And that, again, incentivises them to make the changes we need them to make right now. So what I'm suggesting to you is longer term, further regulation, further imposition of obligations is quite understandable. But short term, we could actually achieve quite a lot immediately without having to go through this whole regulatory process.
When it comes to trying to avoid the pitfalls that we've already seen, given that you really need to recognize the issues first, how difficult is it to look at corporate culture, corporate governance, especially in private companies, in order to be able to set up these regulatory guardrails?
Well, yes, one of the biggest problems with Optus is it's supplying critical infrastructure, but it is a private company. And so we have no, as we call it, disclosure, no transparency about the way the company is run. Now, I believe that in about May 2024, Singtel announced that it would devolve most of the responsibility for running Optus to a board in Australia. And that board was set up with what we call independent directors to make it more accountable. But unfortunately, there's no detail under that. So when you go to the website, when you go to look at Optus documents, you can't work out how it manages the corporation, what's its organisational structure, how it manages its risks. And when we're talking about governance and culture, we need to see that steps are in place to make sure these things are taken seriously. None of that is publicly available. Now, the comparison you need to make is not actually with another telco, it's with banking, because banking also needs a licence and is treated as an essential service in Australia. And there are all sorts of steps of accountability that are required of any bank to a regulator. In that case, it's the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority. So what I'm suggesting is that the same kinds of steps need to be placed on Optus. Some of this for Telstra is achieved by it being a public company and it being accountable as a public company, which Optus doesn't. So if we're not going to have a requirement that it act as a public company or equivalent type of obligations, then what we need to do is have a system in place that says, OK, you need to be accountable to the regulator here, which is the Australian Communications and Media Authority, in the same way or a similar way to banks are accountable to the banking regulator.
You mentioned that in order to put that system in place, the measures would be long-term. But given that we do have a looming bushfire season also, what are some of the vulnerabilities that need to be dealt first with Australia's infrastructure at the moment?
Well, the Australian Communications Media Authority set up a system called the Emergency Call Rules that operated from November. And in those rules, the things they have to do are, for example, make sure that there is what we call camping on. So if the 000 service fails on your network, the network must be immediately shifted to your competitor so that they can get access to 000. So that has to work. Now, the evidence is that they did do that at Optus, but a good number of people, I'd say about in the order of 30%, could not get through to 000. So there's question marks over why that system didn't work. And I think in the last outage that Telstra had, they had problems with that as well. But in addition to that, there's very important communication obligations. You have to let the government know immediately. You have to tell the emergency services themselves who it is that's been trying to call. We talk about welfare checks where we check on patients who were trying to get through, but it's more important to let the emergency services know who it is exactly that missed being able to call you. So it's those real-time results that have been already set by the government through its emergency call rules procedures. We need to make sure that Telstra is Optus is attending to those requirements. And at the moment, we don't know. Now, in fairness to Optus, they are conducting an inquiry to find out what happened and why those things failed. But the truth of the matter is that that's their own inquiry, which they're funding. So the government itself needs independently to be sure that these steps have been taken. And that's why ACMA, the regulator, needs to come in and really take a hard look at these issues.
Helen, thank you for helping us to unpack, I think, what some of these recommendations and fixes that are required should look like. Helen, really great to chat. Helen Bird is Senior Lecturer of Law at Swinburne University. Now, we have more on Australia ahead every Tuesday at 11:40 a.m. if you're watching in Sydney, 8:40 a.m. in Hong Kong. Plus, you can tune into the Bloomberg Australia podcast, which delves into the biggest stories shaping the country's role in global business. Find it on Apple, Spotify, or Bloomberg.com. More ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
We're following JGBs very closely today, especially as we are now seeing bond price yields rising to fresh records, especially for the 30-year yield, as we do have that auction later today. And this, of course, coming at a time when longer maturity JGBs have slumped, investors pricing in more pro-stimulus policies, which could lead to additional debt issuance with the election of pro-stimulus incoming Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. That's it from the Asia trade. Our markets coverage continues as we look ahead to the start of trade. The China show is next. This is Bloomberg.